Hello, I'm Jen. Welcome back to my channel, Literary Love 123, where I combine my master's in English with my passion for the horror genre to talk about the books that I read. In today's video, I'm going to be sipping on some wine while I talk to you all about Night Film by Marisha Pessl. After this quick intro, I'll be right back and we'll get into everything. Night Film is a 2013 novel written by Marisha Pessl. Before we get into the novel itself, I want to give you a brief bio of the author, especially as her background relates to the content of Night Film. She grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, but at the time of the writing of this bio, she was currently living in New York City. And Night Film is set in New York City. She talks about having a creative childhood where she began writing mysteries when she was very young, which will play into the skill at which she's able to write the mystery in Night Film. She went to Northwestern University and majored in film and television. Again, her background in film and television is also an important aspect for Night Film. Then she transferred to Barnard College and majored in contemporary literature and minored in playwriting, both of which we will also see play an important role in her construction of Night Film. So she had a previous work that was published called Special Topics in Calamity Physics, which I have not read yet. And at the end of this video, I'm going to talk about her newest release, which I do have and I do plan to read. But let's get into Night Film itself. So the genre of Night Film is mystery, thriller, suspense, horror, noir. It has a very definite blending of genres. It is mixed media and it is postmodern. So I want to talk about what it means for a work to be postmodern. So I'm going to pull up some notes that I have. My sources for postmodern literature that we'll be talking about here today. One of my sources is Lois Tyson's Critical Theory Today, a user-friendly guide, which saved my life during grad school when I was studying literary theory. And another source that I have is from the online source of Purdue OWL called English 102, Book with English 105 Supplemental. All of that to talk about postmodern literature. Postmodern literature concerns itself with the ways and the places where systems, frameworks, definitions, and certainties begin to break down. It posits the idea that the very act of seeking order or some sort of singular truth is absurd because there exists no unified truth. Post-structuralism holds, or postmodernism, either or, holds that there are many truths, that frameworks must bleed into one another, and that structures will become destabled or decentered, which most definitely happens in Night Film. And you'll see that as we get more into the novel itself. It poses questions that were brought to the forefront by Jacques Derrida, which he called free play. And Derrida spoke at a conference and stated the concept of a centered structure is contradictorily coherent. The concept of centered structure is, in fact, the concept of a free play, which is constituted upon a fundamental immobility and a reassuring certitude, which is itself beyond the reach of the free play. So he gave this lecture in 1966 at Johns Hopkins University, and the title of his lecture is Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. So if you want to dive deeper into Derrida, go ahead, be my guest. But let's kind of simplify it. Thank you, Lois Tyson, and thank you, Purdue OWL, for making postmodernism a lot easier to understand. So let's talk about some concepts of postmodernism versus modernism. So in modernism, you had form. In postmodernism, you'll have antiform. There's a certain hierarchy in modernism, and then there is anarchy in postmodernism. All of these postmodern elements will be evident again as we get into night film. There are certain genres in modernism. It usually is going to stick to a strict genre or boundary. As we'll see in postmodernism, there is a mingling of genres. There is what is called intertextual elements. And let's keep going here. And there is a determinacy to modernism works, whereas in postmodern, you have an indeterminacy. So here are some typical questions. I think this really helps most people to understand how to approach postmodernism. These questions that are typically asked. How is language thrown into free play or questioned in the work? How does the work undermine or contradict generally accepted truths? How does the author or characters in the novel, how do they omit, change, or reconstruct memory and identity? How does a work fulfill or move outside the established conventions of its genre? How does the work deal with the separation or the lack thereof between writer, work, and reader? What ideology does the text seem to promote? What is left out of the text that, if included, might undermine the goal of the work? There are different perspectives in night film, shifting stories, questions of identity. All of these things are elements of postmodern work. And finally, if we changed the point of view of the text, say from one character to another or multiple characters, how would the story change? Whose story is not told in the text? Who is left out? And why might the author have omitted this character's tale? So, now that you have an idea about postmodernism, we will get into night film itself and talk about the postmodern elements as well as the other aspects of the novel. Let me have a sip of wine. All right. So, first of all, let's talk now about the general kind of vibe. When I was a little ways into night film, I thought of it as House of Leaves meets Twin Peaks. The labyrinthine, and I hope I'm saying that right, like labyrinthian nature of night film reminded me of the labyrinthine nature of House of Leaves, where you've got this story that continues to spiral and then it goes in different directions. You're asking questions about how deeply will a character go to solve this mystery? Can this mystery be solved? How deep will I, as the reader, fall into this spiral or this labyrinth? How much of myself am I going to devote to solving everything? That also lends itself to that postmodern idea of the interplay between the author, the characters, and the reader. And I described it as meeting Twin Peaks because, and we'll kind of get into the synopsis now, because in night film, Ashley Cordova, the 24-year-old daughter of controversial and reclusive film director Stanislav Cordova, is found at the beginning of the novel. Her body's found in an abandoned warehouse in Manhattan. So again, this idea of how did Ashley die? Did she choose to take her own life? Did she, was she unalived by someone? What happened to Ashley? That aspect reminded me of Twin Peaks with what happened to Laura Palmer. And you've got someone who is trying to figure it out. Let's talk about who those someones are. And the someones are Scott McGrath, who is a disgraced journalist. He was an award-winning journalist, but he was given some information by an informant that stated that this director, Stanislaus Cordova, was doing something to harm children. So McGrath went on to break that story. And as it turned out, the source of that information was unreliable, and McGrath was fired from his job. So he does, as we know from the opening of the novel, have connections to the Cordova family. Along with two others, Scott McGrath dives into an investigation to try to figure out what did happen to Ashley. He's joined by Hopper, who has a history with Ashley. They were both at this wilderness therapy camp for troubled youth, and they formed a bond there, and they continued to interact over the years. So Hopper has this kind of romantic and redemptive arc that is connected to Ashley. He's also troubled. He's a drifter. He's dealing with addiction, and other trauma issues. So that will kind of give me, real quick, I do want to talk about the other person who helps, and then I do want to get into a few content and trigger warnings. So the other person that's helping Scott and Hopper is Nora. She is an aspiring actress. She worked as a cloakroom attendant at the restaurant where Ashley was last seen. She took Ashley's coat. So she has that connection to Ashley. And we'll talk more about Nora as we get into a spoiler section. So the trigger warnings that I do want to give, there is discussion of someone unaliving themselves, discussions of death, discussions of mental illness. And there is a certain section of the novel, too, where we have transphobic undertones, which I'll talk about more when we get into the spoiler section. So let me talk about what I loved. There were a lot of things I loved about Night Film. Let me just kind of list it all out for you. I enjoyed the postmodern aspect, which also has to do with metafiction, because you have commentary on the novel itself, commentary where the characters are referring to other, elements as far as being self-aware. And again, we'll talk more about that in the spoiler section. I loved the idea of obsession. How far will someone go to uncover the truth? At what cost? I loved the cult aspect. There is a cult following for Stanislaus Cordova. He's a controversial director. He has movies that are considered, well, they're like horror movies, but they're also crime type movies. And I'll talk a little bit more about him and about his movies in a moment, too. But there is a cult following. I loved the mixed media format. I checked, these web pages don't work anymore, but at the initial outset of the publication of this book, you could actually go to certain web pages that Marisha Pessl put in the book, and you could get more information and unlock further stuff online, which is so cool. I'm hoping one day they will get that back up and going. You also have questions of identity. You have life imitating art, or is it art imitating life? Again, that kind of interplay that you see. Elements of horror as catharsis. So, a couple of things that I want to talk about with that aspect of it that I really enjoyed. Of course, as a horror fan, I'm going to love anything that can fall into a category of horror as catharsis. So I just want to read to you a quote from Stanislaus Cordova, this controversial and reclusive director, from a Rolling Stone article about him. Again, Marisha Pessl's like world building and background information, her creation of these legitimate, so to speak, right? Because there's not really a Stanislaus Cordova, but he does pattern some directors we'll talk about in a minute. But just the idea that she went so far as to make this feel so real as a Rolling Stone interview with him. So this is Stanislaus Cordova from the Rolling Stone issue, December 29th, 1977. Mortal fear is as crucial a thing to our lives as love. It cuts to the core of our being and shows us what we are. Will you step back and cover your eyes? Or will you have the strength to walk to the precipice and look out? Do you want to know what is there or live in the dark delusion that this commercial world insists we remain sealed inside like blind caterpillars in an eternal cocoon? Will you curl up with your eyes closed and die? Or can you fight your way out of it and fly? So, his movies explore themes that I want to talk about here. Okay. So, themes that he would explore in his movies: a horrifying underworld lurking beneath what is beautiful and normal, the fractured nature of human identity with its unspoken fears, violent motives, and immoral sexual desires, and the night film itself as a spellbinding, emotionally harrowing experience. And these are the themes that Cordova explored in his films. And there are also the themes that are explored in the novel Night Film itself. So now let me talk a little bit about the directors that Stanislaus Cordova is patterned after. Directors like Stanley Kubrick, who is known for his intensity, known for the way that he mistreated and abused Shelley Duvall in The Shining. Comparisons to David Lynch, again, that idea of confronting this dark underside, this kind of surreal, existing, parallel universe. Dario Argento, Francis Ford Coppola, I know who he is, I always have trouble saying that name, and William Friedkin. He reminded me also of William Friedkin because of The Exorcist, which is my favorite movie of all time, but that's for a different day. But William Friedkin was very intense, very dramatic, and very, I would say, abusive to the actors on The Exorcist. He fired guns off to startle everybody. He actually slapped the actor who played Father Dyer. I've watched this in a commentary. What I think it's, I can't remember the name of the commentary. I'll link it down below. But anyway, he asked the actor who played Father Dyer if he trusted him, and Father Dyer said yes. And they were about to film the scene where, spoiler, Father Karras is lying there dying, and Father Dyer is going to give him his last rites. And before that began filming, Friedkin slapped the actor in the face so he could really cry and get emotional. Also, Chris McNeil, played by Ellen Burstyn, when Reagan slings her and she hits her back, she actually did injure her back in that scene. So the scream that she lets out is from legitimate pain. She wanted that scene to be cut from the film where she's actually hurt, and Friedkin left that in. So you see those kind of comparisons to real life directors whose methods really push the boundaries of what's okay to do. And Cordova has that kind of reputation too, that he pushes and pushes and pushes the actors in his film to the brink of that same kind of pain. All right. And that was one of the things that I did like about it. Not that a director causes pain to the actors, but the idea that this took from real life situations and made more controversy around Stanislaus Cordova. Also appreciated, as I've talked already about, the backstories, the world building, the in depth nature. You have here these photographs, these articles, they are interspersed throughout Night Film. So you've definitely got that mixed media format, which is very, very cool. You also have the occult and witchcraft, and is there something evil, something sinister, something supernatural going on? You have family drama and family trauma. And you also have a dark web element, this secret Cordova fan site. So it's just got so much in the way of construction of all these ideas and bringing them all together into this novel, which that aspect also reminded me of House of Leaves, that mixed media and different stories from different characters and people trying to solve what's really going on and being obsessed with it. So now let's move on to what I didn't love. So I've mentioned some of the transphobic elements, and there's also from the same character, and this is Scott McGrath, our main character, who goes into this secret club that's connected to Stanislaus Cordova. And while he's in that club, he has some transphobic thoughts. And it is also Scott who has some misogynistic statements, such as this one. There was the most mind bending frontier of the natural world. Women. Really, like I roll my eyes so much. So I don't think that this is Marisha Pessl herself putting these ideas out there, but she is attributing these to our main character, Scott, who does appear to me to be someone who would have these kind of thoughts. So take that as you will. I've mentioned the characters of Scott, Nora, who comes along to assist him. We find that this is a little spoiler, but we do find out that she is actually homeless and she ends up coming to live with Scott. But I will say, nothing romantic happens there. Although Nora tries for it too, at least Scott is like, no. So that at least didn't happen. Hopper has already mentioned he's the drifter who is obsessed with laying Ashley to rest in the way that she would have wanted to be and finding out what really happened to her so that she can be at peace in death and so that he can be at peace in the rest of his life. You also have, of course, Stanislaus Cordova, the director, and Ashley, who is deceased. Although Ashley is deceased, we do get flashbacks with her, and she obviously plays a major role in what happens in Night Film. And then we have Inez Gallo, who is Cordova's assistant. She, at different points, has accepted awards for him when he became more reclusive. Some people speculated that she was actually behind his works, and some people even speculated at one point that they were the same person. So she's a very interesting character. Although we don't see her a whole lot in the novel, she is very important. Scott, our main character, also has an ex-wife, Cynthia, and a daughter, Samantha. Cynthia is in and out of the novel a few times. His daughter plays a pretty prominent role in a few parts and has some connections to Ashley too. Now let's move on to talk about the plot and the pacing. At times I did feel like the plot was moving slowly, but the slowness didn't bother me because I felt like that was adding a more realistic element to this novel, because if you are trying to investigate and uncover truth, you're not always going to be uncovering new things. Sometimes there's going to be a lull in what you find. So I appreciated that part. And it worked really well in tandem with the more fast paced and intense parts of Night Film. I really appreciated that. Also, really enjoyed that as the reader, that I was unlocking the doors of this mystery room by room, piece by piece with the character. I changed my mind several times about what really happened to Ashley. Um, I also grappled with whether or not something supernatural was taking place and had taken place, or whether it was all just natural occurrences. The mixed media format and the in-depth discussions of Cordova's films also help to blur the lines between reality and fiction, and I love that. The writing style I would describe as quite immersive. If you get into this book, then you are into it. Like, again, I'm going to reference House of Leaves. If you get sucked in, then you are in. As I mentioned already, it blends genres, elements of mystery, thriller, suspense, horror, and noir. It is complex. It is a layered story. Postmodern, as I mentioned before, other elements are metafictional and intertextual. There are references to Stephen King, to William Blake, to the Blair Witch from the Blair Witch Project, Dostoevsky, and references to my man Poe. There's a passage where Ashley is described as being a child in a kingdom by the sea. So, of course, that's from Annabelle Lee. Now, I want to talk about some quotes. So, one of the quotes that is an example of obsession in the novel. An old reporter is speaking to Scott McGrath about his obsession with Stanislaus Cordova, and he warns him that he's going to end up in a bad place again. This is what he tells him: a tapeworm that's eaten its own tail. No use going after it. All it will do is wrap around your heart and squeeze all the blood out. A quote that speaks to the meta aspect of Night Film. It was always surprising to me how ferociously the public mourned a beautiful stranger, especially one from a famous family. Into that empty form, they could unload the grief and regret of their own lives, be rid of it, feel lucky and light for a few days, comforted by the thought, at least that wasn't me. We can see aspects of that happening on a regular basis. Our obsession with celebrity deaths, or our obsession with beautiful people who go missing, or beautiful people who die. A quote I want to bring up that is related to perspective and reality versus fantasy and the subjective nature of memory and experience. The most unreliable witness still has the truth inside them. And that really is evident when you go through different characters that are encountered by the main characters in the novel as they're trying to unravel what happened to Ashley. You also have quotes about pushing boundaries and confronting darkness. So Hopper is talking about something that Ashley told him. He said, Ashley told me her father taught her to live life way beyond the cusp of it, way out in the outer reaches where most people never had the guts to go. And then Stanislaus Cordova himself about his work at the peak, which I'm going to talk about the peak in just a minute, but that's the spoiler section. He said, I love to put my characters in the dark, It's only then that I can see exactly who they are. And then that lends itself to the question, is art imitating life? Is life imitating art? How far is Stanislaus pushing his characters in his films? Yes, but also how far is he pushing the actors in real life as they're filming these movies? So now we're going to get into spoilers. So big sip of wine, and then we'll get into spoilers. The Peak is a sprawling, private, secretive estate in which Cordova and his family live. Not only do they live there, but Cordova begins to film all of his movies there at the Peak. Now, I want to talk about the description of the Peak and then talk about how it reminds me of the description of the House of Usher in Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, and the description of Hill House in Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. So let me describe the Peak to you. It sat in moonlight, a hulking mansion of such absolute darkness it made the surrounding night gray. Its grandeur looked straight out of the European countryside, a lost world of horse-drawn carriages and candlelight. Spiked, gabled roofs pitched upward, lancing the sky. I could discern an ornate entrance pavilion, a colonnade across the front drive, 3 stories of windows, every one unlit, all of it fortified with shadow, as if shadows were the very mortar that kept it standing. In fact, the house seemed to challenge the laws of the physical world, the inevitable slide of man's grandest constructions into decay and ruin, boasting instead that it would be rising over that hill for centuries to come. Quite a gothic, drenched description. Now I want to read to you Poe's description of the House of Usher. I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half pleasurable, because poetic sentiment with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul, which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after dream of the reveler upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. There was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. What was it? I paused to think. What was it that so unnerved me in the contemplation of the house of Usher? And now I dropped my copy of The Haunting of Hill House. So let me get that real quick and I'll pop right back up to remind you of the description of Hill House. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its heels, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, Bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone. So there is something foreboding about the peak when Scott McGrath ends up encountering it. He and Nora and Hopper are able to very stealthily and with difficulty make their way in to the peak itself to try to see what kind of information they can turn up there about Stanislaus Cordova, about what happened to Ashley, and about other mysteries surrounding members of the Cordova family, because we do find out that one of Cordova's wives ended up drowning on the estate, and there's questions about whether that was an accident, whether she did it intentionally, whether someone else did it to her. So they're trying to solve all of these mysteries while trying not to give away the fact that they have snuck into this estate. So I want to talk more about the estate itself and about the uncanny nature of the estate. Because as I mentioned, not only is this where the family lived, but this is also where movies were filmed. And the sets are all still there with all of the set pieces. So let me read this description to you that Scott McGrath uh, thinks. The place had a frozen in time feel, as if life had stopped here mid conversation. No one seemed to have set foot here in decades. I didn't want to even attempt to get my mind around the fact that I was donning Brad Jackson's 70s era clothes, that I was literally rummaging through Thumbscrew. So, Thumbscrew is one of Cordova's films. Brad Jackson is the main character who potentially did something to harm a child in that movie. So the reason Scott McGrath is having to put on this actor's or character's clothing is because the only way they could get into the peak was to go through this waterway and try to sneak under this fence, and they all ended up getting wet. So he's trying to obviously find some dry clothes, and there's this couple of clues in the film Thumbscrew. There's a briefcase that supposedly, if anyone opened that briefcase, they could see what Brad Jackson had done to this young boy. But the briefcase is never opened in the movie. It falls behind this bed. So as Scott McGrath is trying to, sneak around the set, try to find evidence, he actually finds the briefcase that fell behind the bed in the movie. It's like there. So again, that makes him start questioning, what if Cordova's films were real? He says the terrors on screen, real terrors, the murders, real murders. Was it possible? He's also thinking this because there's a plaid shirt worn by the young boy in the film, and he finds the plaid shirt and it has what he thinks is blood on it. So he starts to question if these films are only fiction or if there were actual murders and Cordova was filming these actual murders. There are also these black robed figures at the peak who are very creepy, and they end up like hunting down, trying to find Hopper, Cordova, and Nora and get them off the property. They all end up making it out. So I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about that, but that's very eerie. That's the cult element, this protecting Stanley's estate. Supposedly he had connections to the local townspeople that had formed this cult that was into demonic practices. So much of that. Again, there's really too much, even for a deep dive, for me to talk a whole lot about that. And so the question then begins to arise. Scott McGrath is afraid that he himself is in a Cordova movie and he's going to end up being murdered by Cordova or this cult around him. Scott McGrath also has a friend who is a professor and is absolutely obsessed with Cordova and his films. He teaches several classes at the university about Cordova's films, and he has cats that are named after characters or elements in Cordova's films. And so Scott McGrath is going to talk to him, and this professor says, this son and this son and this son, you might be doomed if you're in a McGrath or you're in a Cordova movie. So again, that idea of metafiction and art imitating life or life imitating art. What we do find out, and this is big spoiler, is that all of the accusations, all of the supernatural elements that were supposedly there are not really what is going on. We do find out, and this is a content and trigger warning for cancer. Ashley developed cancer at a young age, and there would be times of her going into remission and times of her having a recurrence. So a lot of the darkness that Cordova was speaking about and tapping into in his work was because he was dealing with this very real life pain of his daughter having cancer. There are suggestions and so-called evidence in the novel that Ashley had been infiltrated by this curse or evil spirit, and accusations that Cordova was trying to go and pass that on to other children in order to save Ashley's life. So again, you have questions throughout the novel where you're asking, is that what's really happening? And then you find out the truth of what's going on. Or is it all true? Could there have been supernatural elements? Do we know everything? Some of that is left up for interpretation. One of the things that does happen too, and again, we're in definite spoiler territory, is that by the end of the novel, McGrath actually gets to meet Cordova in person. He thinks he meets him at one point at a nursing home, but that's not really him. That's somebody pretending to be him so that Cordova can go on and have a truly private life. So one of the things that Scott McGrath realizes when he finally actually sees Cordova in person is how they are more similar than he thought. So I do want to read that passage to you because it also has a lot to say about the inescapable passage of time and just the way that life is fleeting. I realized, staring at this man, that I was actually just staring at myself, at what I'd become much sooner and more suddenly than I'd ever know. Life was a freight train barreling toward just one stop, our loved ones streaking past our windows in blurs of color and light. There was no holding on to any of it and no slowing it down. So, what did I rate this book? 5 stars. A big 5-star. I recommend this for people who are fans, again, of House of Leaves or Twin Peaks. If you like postmodern work, if you like meta, intertextual, blending of genres, mixed media, then you'll probably like Night Film. I don't recommend it to those who prefer a more straightforward type of story. Anyone who really wants characters that are very fleshed out. If you want to like all of your characters, you probably won't like this because we don't have necessarily any truly really likable characters. Maybe Scott McGrath's daughter. If you're annoyed by metafiction, if you're annoyed by mixed media, if you don't want to fall down a rabbit hole, you probably won't enjoy night film. But if any of the other aspects that I enjoyed or that I've talked about appeal to you, then I'd love to see you pick it up and let me know what you think about it. I am late to the game in this one since it was published in 2013, but I think I found it at the right time for me. So, thank you so very much for watching. If you have already read Night Film, I'd love to know what you think about it, whether you loved it or hated it. I do want to mention, too, the recent novel by Marisha Pessl called Darkly. This is a dark academia type novel, and I will be reading it sometime soon, I think. So if you want to do a buddy read, let me know. Then I also want to mention that coming up on my channel, I will have a review of Private Rights by Julia Armfield and The Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Eugenides. I also want to mention that November will be Vampvember. That is a readathon, watchathon, activityathon that I have created and will be hosting. So look for more information to come about Vampvember, especially at the end of September. Thank you again for watching this deep dive. I would love it if you would hit like, if you would subscribe, if you would hit that bell so we can keep on talking about books that we enjoy. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!